And we want to turn our attention now to Russia's war on Ukraine. A stark warning from the U.S. on that. Russia will face catastrophic consequences should Vladimir Putin strike Ukraine with a nuclear weapon. Have a listen.
We have been clear with them and emphatic with them that the United States will respond decisively alongside our allies and partners. And we have protected those communications, which we have done privately to the Russians, but they well understand what they would face if they went down that dark road.
What exactly would a response look like? Mélanie Joly is Minister of Foreign Affairs. She's with us from New York. Hi, Minister Joly. Good to have you back on our program.
It's a pleasure, Russian.
I want to start off on the subject of Russia and in particular some of the discussions going on between yourself and Canada's allies. Over the weekend, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the U.S. Will act decisively if Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what Canada is prepared to do in the event of that happening.
Well, of course, I've had numerous conversations with Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, last week at the UN. We had a G7 meeting. Of course, we want to be prepared for any form of scenario. But I'll be heading later this week in Washington, D.C., and we'll continue to engage on this very issue. We are extremely preoccupied by the reckless rhetoric of President Putin, but also the fact that he's using this nuclear threat, Vashi, shows how much this is a desperate man, which plans are not, which war is not going according to the plan. So clearly we want to address this head on. And I think that you heard the UN Secretary General also mentioning that this rhetoric is also unthinkable.
From your perspective, do you think Putin is bluffing when he makes the nuclear threat?
I really think that we need to take this extremely seriously. I think also that in the context of Canada's diplomatic engagement, what we've seen is that when President Putin is using this rhetoric, he's certainly not building allies around the world, particularly with the global South. There's been behind this entire war going on in Ukraine, there's been also another war, which is one on information. And the West, have been really forceful in countering any form of narrative that Putin has been using, particularly in Africa and Latin America and Asia. But when he uses this rhetoric, I think he's isolating himself.
I guess what I'm trying to ascertain is how seriously the threat is being taken by your government, and then what a response would constitute. So would, for example, it be a red line where Canada would consider military engagement if a nuclear action was taken, or if he made good on that threat?
Like I said, we will always work with our allies. We will coordinate amongst the G7. This is a conversation that this is a decision that we will not take in isolation. This is a decision we will take amongst the G7, which is UK, Europe, and US. And at the same time, I would say that we're following very closely what's going on with these sham referendums as people are obliged to vote while being threatened. We know that these referendums, these sham referendums, are used by Putin himself to give a form of fake legitimacy to his claims of annexation of Ukraine's territory. And therefore, what we want to make sure is that we call out these different sham referendums, like I mentioned many times last week, but also that we do so while bringing many countries to the table. The G7, Europe, the West in general, but also countries from Africa, from Latin America, and Asia. This is fundamental.
And I certainly take your point, and I think our audience does, about the need for activities done in concert and consultation with our allies. And I know that's been the position of the government right from the outset of this. I guess what I'm trying to figure out for our audience is just, if, for example, the Canadian government would rule out military engagement, as it has so far, right? You've been very clear that, unless something happens on NATO territory, we're not going to go in there as a military. Does that calculation, though, change if a nuclear weapon is used? That's what I'm really wondering.
I know, and you've been asking me the question many times, but like I mentioned to you many times, is that we will take that decision amongst allies.
So you can't tell the audience, for example, Minister, with all due respect, you can't tell the audience whether or not you have ruled out that kind of military engagement. You have not.
Vashi, I think what we're talking about right now is the biggest security threat since the Second World War. And so, of course, we are following the situation very closely and looking at many scenarios. But of course, as well, we will engage with Canadians should the international peace in general be at stake. For the time being, Ukrainians are dying, and we need to make sure that we're helping them. And that's what we're doing. That's why my colleague Mélanie has said that we will be sending more weapons and that we need to send many more weapons as the situation is critical.
And Minister, just before I let you go, I do want to ask you about something else that you and the Prime Minister announced today. That's sanctions on Iran. More specifically, I should say, on their so-called morality police due to all the protests that are going on there after Mahsa Amini died in their custody. And more specifically, I just wanted to ask, you announced the sanctions writ large, but you haven't identified the individuals who will be sanctioned. The U.S. has done that already when they made the announcement. So I'm just wondering what timeline you have for the announcing exactly who will be sanctioned.
So very soon, like you mentioned in your question, we will be sanctioning the morality police. We will be sanctioning its leadership, and we will be announcing the different names very soon. But we wanted to make sure that Iranian women who are protesting as we speak in Tehran and across Iran knew that we were on their side supporting them, because at the end of the day, women's rights are human rights, and we stand with them.
And certainly women's rights are at the heart of what is happening in Iran. And I heard you in your speech today also talking about Canada's desire to ultimately defend women's rights right around the world. And it's in that vein then I ask why your government has not listed the IRGC as a terrorist entity.
Well, of course, our goal is to make sure that we have an approach where we're sanctioning the people of the morality police, the leadership, like I mentioned. But also, we don't have an embassy in Tehran anymore. The Harper government has decided at the time that we would be having no diplomatic relationship with Iran, and that's still the stance of this government.
I'm not sure how that answers the question about why you wouldn't list the IRGC as a terrorist entity. The House of Commons voted in favor of it back in 2018. Your government has so far refused to do so. Should the events of the past 10 days change your approach?
Like I mentioned, we are going ahead with strong sanctions. That's definitely our goal. And we've had a principled approach since the beginning. And at the same time, we're fighting for accountability for the families of PS 752. Which is another issue that we have with Iran. I'll be going to Montreal tomorrow at ICAO because we're seeking justice for these families that went through a very difficult tragedy following the reckless actions of Iran.
They did, and in fact, they specifically have called on your government to list the IRGC as a terrorist entity since it was responsible for shooting down that plane who killed their family members. Is your answer to them that that is not among the considerations of your government right now?
I think that the families of the victims and Iranians across Canada can be proud that we're moving in the right directions by imposing strong sanctions. We're doing so as the US also imposed strong sanctions. And we call on other countries in the world, particularly the European Union, to go ahead and do the same.
And Minister, I'm not taking away from those sanctions or the fact that your government is levying them, but the government of the U.S., for example, has listed the IRGC as a terrorist entity. The families of the PS 752 victims would like your government to consider it. Is your government not just, I understand you're saying the sanctions are what you're pursuing right now. Does that mean that it's a hard no to listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity, especially given what's going on right now?
Vashi, you've asked me the question many times, and I've given you my answer many times. So I've given you the answer that we're sanctioning the morality police, we're sanctioning also its leadership, and we will continue to put pressure on the Iranian regime. That's our goal, and we are standing by all these women protesting around the world. That's why in our first national address this year at the UN, we specifically mentioned it. We specifically also announced sanctions during the UN speech, which is something that has never been done.
Okay, Minister, I'm out of time. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.